In the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union, one of the largest military powers on Earth, invaded a country smaller than the state of New Jersey. The Soviets expected victory in 2 weeks. They sent 500,000 men, hundreds of tanks, massive artillery. Their target? Finland, a nation of forests, frozen lakes, and barely enough soldiers to fill a stadium. But what happened next stunned the world. Because the Finns didn't just resist. They humiliated the Red Army and turned the Arctic wilderness into the most dangerous battlefield of the early war. This is the story of the Winter War. Why the Soviets attacked. Months before the invasion, the Soviet Union began demanding territory from Finland, claiming it needed a buffer zone to protect Leningrad. The city was dangerously close to the Finnish border, and Stalin believed that without extra land, the USSR was vulnerable to enemy attack. But Finland refused every demand. They wouldn't hand over territory, and they wouldn't allow the Soviets to turn them into another obedient satellite state. So Stalin made his move. On November 30th, 1939, without even declaring war, Soviet forces crossed the border in massive numbers. Moscow insisted it was a defensive operation, but the world immediately recognized it as an invasion. Finland faced impossible odds, outnumbered 3-1 in soldiers, 100-1 in tanks, and 30-1 in aircraft. On paper, Finland's collapse looked guaranteed. But the war would reveal a very different reality, one that stunned the world. The Red Army's disaster. The Soviet Union entered Finland with overwhelming numbers, but with shockingly poor preparation. Their soldiers wore dark uniforms that made them easy targets against the blinding white snow. Their heavy tanks struggled on Finland's narrow forest paths, constantly getting stuck or ambushed. And after Stalin's brutal purges had killed or imprisoned thousands of experienced officers, the Red Army marched with commanders who lacked skill, confidence, and battlefield instincts. Then came the real enemy, the weather. Temperatures plunged below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Engines froze solid. Weapons jammed. Soldiers who lacked proper winter clothing suffered horrific frostbite, and many died without ever meeting the enemy. Frostbite and exposure claimed as many Soviet lives as Finnish bullets. The Red Army had entered a true Arctic war completely unprepared. Meanwhile, the Finns, raised in these conditions, had every advantage. Finland wasn't just fighting the Soviets. Winter itself was fighting on Finland's side. How Finland fought back. Finland countered the invasion with something the Soviets could never match: absolute mastery of snow, ice, and winter warfare. Finnish soldiers moved swiftly on skis, gliding through forests where Soviet vehicles couldn't follow. Clad in white camouflage suits, they became nearly invisible, striking suddenly before fading back into the snowy terrain. They carried light gear, allowing them to attack with speed and precision. Their signature strategy was the Mahti tactic, slicing long Soviet columns into isolated pockets and then destroying each pocket one at a time. It was guerrilla warfare built for the frozen wilderness. Among the defenders were legendary figures, none more famous than Simo Häyhä, the White Death, who became one of the deadliest snipers in history with over 500 confirmed kills. The Soviets began to fear the forests, fear the silence, fear the unseen white shapes drifting between trees. Finland had turned winter into a weapon. The battles that shocked the world. One of the most shocking Soviet failures came at the Battle of Suomussalmi. A large Soviet force pushed deep into Finland with tanks, vehicles, and thousands of troops. But the Finns, outnumbered 4-1, attacked from the forests, cut supply lines, and left Soviet units freezing and starving. Entire divisions collapsed as the temperature dropped and ammunition ran out. The disaster grew even worse at Rate Road, where Finnish ski troops encircled and annihilated a trapped Soviet column. The aftermath stretched for miles: frozen bodies, burnt trucks, abandoned weapons, and shattered tanks. News of these victories spread across the world. How was a tiny nation with a tiny army inflicting such severe defeats on one of the largest militaries on Earth? Finland's resistance shocked Europe and turned them into a global symbol of courage and determination. The Winter War became a story of strength against overwhelming odds. The tide turns. Despite their losses, the Soviets didn't quit. By early 1940, they reorganized and adjusted to Finnish tactics. New commanders were brought in, and massive artillery bombardments began. Thousands of shells fired daily. The Red Army slowly adapted to the conditions and pushed with overwhelming force. Their main focus became the Mannerheim Line, Finland's strongest line of defense in the south. For weeks, the line held under brutal pressure. Trenches filled with frozen bodies, barricades were rebuilt every night, and exhausted soldiers fought waist-deep in snow. But Finland's supplies were nearly gone. Ammunition was running out, soldiers were exhausted, and the small nation simply didn't have reserves to replace losses. By February, the Soviet army was finally breaking through. Finland had achieved miracles on the battlefield, but logistics and manpower were catching up. The tide of the war was shifting, and Finland knew it couldn't hold forever. The end of the war. The Winter War ended on March 13, 1940, with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland was forced to surrender 11% of its territory, including its second-largest city, along with critical economic areas. More than 400,000 civilians had to abandon their homes and resettle deeper inside Finland. Yet despite the painful loss, Finland achieved something much greater: survival. It remained independent, avoided Soviet occupation, and preserved its government and national identity. For a nation facing such overwhelming odds, that alone was a victory. But the war came at an enormous cost for the Soviet Union. Over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. Their victory was hollow, exposing severe weaknesses in the Red Army. The world saw the Soviet military as far less capable and feared, and Hitler took careful note of this when planning his invasion of the USSR just months later. The Winter War lasted just 105 days, but its legacy still echoes. It showed that courage and strategy can challenge overwhelming force. It proved that a small nation fighting for its home can reshape a global power. Finland didn't win the territory, but it won something far more important: respect, survival, and a permanent place in the history of impossible resistance. The Winter War wasn't just a battle. It was a lesson that even in the coldest winter, a nation's spirit can burn hotter than any army's fire.